It is a concern also in the US, and some airports are already working on it. Others are a little bit, let's say, more the followers. And this is from the FAA, that is in the United States, the Airport Cooperative Research Program. And you can actually see on the map, so these are indicated as the vulnerable airports in the US. And interesting is that they're all on coast, and especially the east and south coast are hurricane sensitive. And some are even very close to sea level or even below sea level, like the one in New Orleans. That's the Louis Armstrong International Airport. And I worked in New Orleans, but also after Hurricane Sandy in New York, and this is one of the examples. New York has about 5 airports, but it were all flooded after Hurricane Sandy. And this is John F. Kennedy Airport, so that is near Queens, Jamaica Bay, so that is southeast of New York City. And it was a sort of considered that for especially calamity response, that what if just one of those 5 airports would still be open to use for recovery, for aid, for help. And therefore, together with students from the TU Delft, we thought about a tidal barrier of this Jamaica Bay. And that is so here is the other view. It is still an ecological area where a bird's habitat, but then a tidal barrier would be open all the time. Only during a hurricane it could be closed, and then you have one airport close to the city still open. And at the same time, that also could generate a lot of more developments connecting to the city, like an airport city as well. Another example, because not all cities or areas have the ability, or let's say the opportunity, to have dikes or protection like we have in the Netherlands. And this is in the east of Australia and near the town of Rockhampton. And this airport actually, and also the city, experience floodings almost every year because of the season. And this is coping with the floodings without having dikes. So they have flexible flood protection. You can see on the left, since they can, let's say, predict or await the flooding, they will, let's say, cancel or evacuate all the aircraft, protect the terminal, and then during the flooding inspect the flexible flood defenses, and then afterwards they will clean the runways from the debris and sediment again. And interesting is that Australia is not only, let's say, fighting the water, but also embracing it and using it. And that's more to the south, where they have a lot of water, rainwater deficit, and to deal with droughts. And examples are Canberra Airport, Adelaide Airport. So this is a photo of the recycled water, or let's say the utilization of rainwater. And it is it is also used for cooling. It's about the recycled toilet flushing, etc. And from this kind of experiences, from flooding, but also the use of water scarcity, we came up from all these examples with what we call the climate resilient airport framework. And it's partly about adaptation. So it's about primarily flood protection, but also dealing with weather extremes. It is in achieving the environmental impact, dealing with it. And it is about sustainability, about how we can make a more adaptive airport planning, as well as incorporate sustainability in greening airport operations as well. And this was already what we were working on. And a few years ago, together with NACO was assigned to do a global study for the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. And that was initiated from an agreement from the COP25 looking at different sectors of infrastructure, and one of those are, of course, airports. And until today, only phase 1 was being executed, and that was to understand airports' perception on impact of increasing in frequency of extreme events, so hazards, and the impact of changes in the built environment and around airports. So it's about dealing with that. But just to give a sort of, let's say, first impression of what are the risks and issues dealing with those disasters. And that study consisted of a literature review, a research on what dimensions, but also the online survey on multiple airports, so hundreds were invited, and then a selection that contributed to the focus group discussions. And I will only go into some bits because it is still, let's say, confidential. Already introduced, the focus within the questions to those airports around the world were, let's say, categorized in, let's say, 3 parts of resilience. So one is the operations, this, for example, the landing, taking off, baggage, passenger handling. It's about infrastructure, the real physical assets. And then it's about organization, about, okay, how does the airport collaborate with stakeholders, but also about financial planning and business strategy. This gives you an impression of the respondents. So this is around the world, the airports that have been included in the survey, with also a sort of distribution of the let's say the size of those airports in passengers handling. And these are the most important hazards and disasters, and especially also in relation to exposure. And that is in a sort of what we call the airport exposure index, but it's just a sort of percentage distribution. So in that list, extreme precipitation, so extreme rainfall, but also winter situation like the icing conditions, storms and winds, extreme heat, sea level rise, other natural hazards that could be earthquakes or erosion, and public health. And some, of course, are have a relation. And the way forward, we included for the deeper impact context, saying that yeah, it's about risk appetite for airports because they're sort of their business model. Besides the community, let's say, responsibility. It's also about risk assessment practices, and maybe to be more proactive than or reactive. And it's about adaptive capacity and how to, because an airport would not be able to only to implement measures themselves, but also to do that in a collaboration with its region or surrounding areas. I brought 3 cases. So one is the Vancouver airport, and it builds up in proactivity, so to say. And to start with Vancouver is that this is a rather, I would say, reactive situation. Vancouver International Airport is on Airport Island. It's an island in the river system on the coast of the west coast of Canada. And it is an island that is also below sea level, like Schiphol, but then not protected by multiple lines of defense or multiple dike systems, but only one dike surrounded by rivers and sea. But it is also vulnerable for rainfall, precipitation, and groundwater as well. And this is just some pictures. And actually, this is actually the airport is flooded, or let's say have to cope with too much water on a daily basis. So you can see landing lights continuously flooded, and you can actually It can be implied that it is always like electricity, power supply, that there always are problems with maintenance, with the continuously of keeping these assets active. What we did is to sort of analyze is the island, and you can actually see it is divided in catchment areas. It also has a drainage that is both connected to the groundwater drainage, but also for stormwater drainage. You can see long distances of drainage, and it is having a pump station, but also flood boxes. And flood boxes means that when the sea level is lower than the elevation of the island, you can actually discharge in gravity flow. Otherwise, you have to pump. When you have high tide or low tide, you can actually have gravity flow. High tide, you have to pump. Pump capacity is limited, so you need also storage in the premises of the airport itself. And therefore, we analyzed this, okay, to quantify what we can discharge, but also what we need to store. And that is quite a lot. And it was also lacking in storage. At the same time, because of the saline surrounding, like seawater, and you have to this salt sort of blocking the infiltration of the soil. So we call that sodic. And the sodic soils are really a problem, especially when want to having, let's say, temporary storage or infiltration possible. There was flood risk management analysis done, especially on stormwater, so for different return periods, and also to look at what solutions could help, and especially to limit the distance or to have, let's say, to have more storage temporarily in the system. Another issue is also the protection of the island. The island is surrounded by a dike, but the dike is owned by various stakeholders or owners, like the wildlife, so the ecological organization, but also the Vancouver Airport Authority partly, and the city of Richmond in this case. You can actually consider that this could generate problems, and that it does. For instance, on maintenance, but also on want to have improved dike defenses. And this shows you the high and the low tides. That is every day, and where the airside elevation is. That is within the blue. So you can imagine that during the day, the water is higher than the elevation of the airport, but also lower. And it is sort of fluctuating around that airside elevation. And then at the same time, it is also subject to subsidence as well. And of course, there is a prediction on sea level rise. So this fluctuation will move. So the elevation of what we saw here, airside elevation will go down, and the fluctuation of that sea level will go up. So the pressure of water through, let's say, like the sea pitch in the island will increase as well. So the infiltration will become less also. And that is also what we see in the groundwater levels, in the fluctuation and measurements. And actually they use that groundwater levels also because it can help avoid problems on the surface. So when they have 32 deep water wells, and they are pumped, so they can actually, during a rainfall event, because otherwise you have to deal with water from different sides at the same time, so they will pump, but this is only temporary effect, of course, and really engineered. I think the biggest challenge is, and that is and that is the soil and the geology, and especially the risk of an earthquake. And here you can see the cross-section of the soft soils, especially around airport islands. And the earthquake hazard could generate a liquefaction of soils, and especially then just the dikes would slide away. And we consider that as a sort of end of life for the airport. This was only the risk assessment. What we did for Singapore Changi Airport was that actually we went further and also more broader in the sense of climatic hazards. Changi Airport is on Singapore. Singapore is an island state. And what we did was to develop a little bit based on what we used to do in a climate stress test in the Netherlands for cities, is that we started to do a climate stress test for Changi as one of the first, I think, in the world. And that before going into the stress test, we looked at other airports, and especially to benchmark those. What are the characteristics to indicate the relevant climate and environmental factors like wind or lightning, heat stress, etc. Identifying critical assets, both physical but also in operational sense, the impacts on assets, and then try to develop a climate change adaptation policy, like adaptation pathways. We looked at different airports, so both in the region but also in size. One of the interesting things is that this is an example of that benchmark, is that looking at to the left on the local measures of Singapore. Singapore is on a land reclamation like Schiphol, but Schiphol is below sea level. Singapore is just above sea level. It's not really protected by a dike, but it is depending on the gravity discharge of rainwater. At the same time, although there is not that much sea level, let's say, predicted like in the North Sea, but still that land reclamation is sinking. So what we did in the benchmark is to look at what airports have a sort of flood or defense line of defense in a perimeter. So you can see the different levels. So Singapore has no protection perimeter. Bangkok, Suvarni Bhumi, what we saw, has one dike ring. And in Amsterdam, Schiphol, we have multiple rings of defenses. In the second stage, we looked at climate factors. And then especially what's interesting is in the rainfall and the sea level rise. And then the PUB, that's the Water Authority of Singapore, was very strict in giving us the scenarios. So we looked at different scenarios and also combinations of those. And that could be interesting also, like for Vancouver, although we didn't do the climate stress test there, not yet. And we looked at critical assets, and that's interesting to see what, like the fuel farm, but also in landing systems, etc., that are really vital for the operations, like landing, taking off, etc., the whole function of the airport. And we did calculations in models to look at the impact to the local situation, but also to the assets, and in combination of rainfall and sea level rise as well. And that gives us insights for adaptation solutions. And one of this is that we looked at solutions locally. You can actually, that is to protect one single asset, for example. And that's the example what we saw in Rockhampton, having a movable, flexible flood barrier, maybe a fixed one locally, like going up to like when entering the metro system or the subsurface systems, you go up first on the stairs and then down, having a fixed flood barrier. Or it is about the airport perimeter, or even more regional, like we have in Schiphol. And then we can actually maybe introduce levees, tidal gates, like the tidal barrier, but also making room for more management infrastructure for water management, like detention or detention ponds, pump stations, etc. So this was the strategy. And we looked at a model to calculate those interventions and see what effects that could be. So we made a distinction between near term and the long term. In the near term, that could be improvements in the drainage system, what we also considered as an advice in Vancouver. And that actually saves you less ponding, although we need a pathway and a more structural, bigger intervention for the longer term. And that would be the more regional protection as well. At the same time, interesting enough, is that the Singapore climate change study especially focused on, again, disasters. And at the same time, Singapore is already considered as a frontrunner in dealing with water scarcity. It is an island surrounded by seawater, and it is its fresh water supply. It's working very hard to what they call to establish their national tap, and that is their own self-sufficient fresh water supply. So the whole island is considered like a rainwater collector. And in the island, there are several reservoirs and water systems that are not only functional or beautiful or to use, but also has to be clean enough to provide in their water supply. And we also looked at Changi, how that airport could be, let's say, contribute to that national tap. At the same time, there was already the biggest water treatment plant for drinking water is on the airport, producing new water, and that water is partly also what the effluent of the wastewater treatment plant, and at the same time it could also clean the collected water from rain. And you can see the ambitious the ambition of Singapore also in the architecture, and this is real. This is not a science fiction film. This is a jewel at Changi Airport that also has a role in the passenger convenience, or let's say the adventure, but also shows you the ambition of Changi to be one of the, let's say, most ambitious and frontrunner cities in blue and green. Okay, the final example is Mexico Airport, and although it was not built, it still, I think, is interesting because it includes a lot of interesting ambitions and ideas. Mexico City is really different than the others because Mexico City is 2,000 meters above sea level. It's in a former island, a lake, of the Lake of the Incas, Lake Texcoco. And because of developing a city in a lake, you can actually imagine that there is something with soft soils, land subsidence, but it's also vulnerable to earthquakes, water shortage because of too much urban pressure, too many people wanting water, flash floods because of the surrounding hills, and water supply and sanitation. The photo shows you the current airport, and the whole city, including the airport, is experiencing the effects of the subsidence on a year, let's say, annual basis. So they have to make repairs every year to cope with that problems of subsidence. And therefore, also there's a question mark, because the ambition was to create this new regional airport. for the Americas. Is that a threat or is it an opportunity also for the city as well? And to start with a sort of historical context, so this is the 16th century of Lake Texcoco, where Mexico City was developed. And at that time, you can only see, so this is the lake, so that's the biggest blue area. And that lake is becoming smaller while the city is growing. The city is growing to the left, that small white dot. And this is in the 20th century. And then it's growing even faster after the Second World War. And the lake almost disappears. And the green area is actually the projected area where the new airport has to become, or to realize. This is that location. You can see a very distinct line between the urban sprawl or urban area of the city, and then this more open wasteland. And actually it looked like this. So this was the plant, and it was not without reason that this was not built, because of the extreme bad situation of the soil. At the same time, it is also the city is very thirsty in fresh water. You can imagine in earthquake sense, it is really a big challenge to build. This has to be the new airport, and actually, this is one of the terminals. So there has the plan was to create 2 terminals, 4 runways, and already said to consider that as a mega airport, even larger than a major one, serving the whole America, so from the North to the South Americas. One of those buildings should have in a roof area, the second largest, or maybe the largest roof area of a building in the world. The design was Norman Foster and Partners, Arab, and together with NACO and Haskoning, but also the local consultants, we worked on a water management strategy. And this is more, let's say, the detail. And what is interesting of the roof is that it has these holes in it, and that was for capturing air, but also water. So what we looked at is that, okay, we have to deal with too much rainwater. At the same time, we can use it. So we have to find areas to store it. At the same time, we have paved areas that are actually collecting that water. So you can see this is the land distribution of paved and unpaved, but also strip areas. Strip areas are the open, not paved areas in between taxiways and runways. And what we came up with is to use the local materials of the Zondle, that's a sort of volcanic stone with a lot of let's say a very porous material. And it was already used to make repairs on pavements, also on the existing airport. And what if that is already used as a part of the construction? Why not store water in it? So we made a design for that, and also did calculations and also some measurements locally on having an filtration system that is actually combined with the runways, or partly. And that worked then on different scales. So these are the catchment areas that actually collect the water to these and then pumped. And what is not what is not being pumped, like the surplus of water, that has to be stored under the runway in the Zondle. And this is then the limited discharge to the lakes that are maintained by Conagua. So that's the water authority of Mexico City. And we did some calculations also on the behavior. So both in the infiltration combined with the discharge, the more hydraulic system with the hydrology on different situations. This shows you the once per 100 years 4-hour event, but also once per 500 a year 4-hour event. And then looking more closely to that building, because it is also about water positive architecture in this case, and not only having green roofs, but also the roof as a rainwater collector to use it, because Mexico City is really demanding in fresh water supply. So this is in the building, and you can see the tunnels through the roof, that holes that are collecting all the water and bringing it down under the building. This is more the technical scheme to the left. So the water storage under the building. And our whole architecture is a sort of water driven to collect as most water as possible and to provide in the water demand of the airport itself, and maybe even partly as a water supplier to the city. And that contributes to what was suggested to go for a LEED Platinum V4, that is a sustainability label for the building. At the same time, we also looked at the historical context, and we of course noticed that the whole Inca Lake was not there anymore, and also considering the earthquake, the sensitivity for earthquakes, why not having a floating airport instead in the Lake Texcoco? And then having the Lake Texcoco as the freshwater lake next to the city. And this was not elaborated, it was just an idea. So I made this render of the North Sea airport, but then rendered it to the Lake Texcoco. Yeah, this is my final slide. So I will stop the sharing.
Yeah, nice overview of international airports and sustainability. Yeah, not only climate adaptation. Yeah, nice. Are there any questions?
Very good presentation. Thank you, Nanco. I saw a lot of solutions, a lot of issues, a lot of partly solutions, but that's of course the road to get there. So very nice to see. However, what I noticed that was not really much abundant in your presentation is the talk about elevation. Of course, I know that's a really big issue, especially if you have existing airports. However, I was looking at some of your pictures and I saw this huge catchments areas for these airports, and talks about the dikes and keeping those construction flood proof, etc., etc. But there was actually no talk about elevating the airplane strip, the landing strip themselves. I'm wondering, is that a discussion that's stranded because of financial issues, technical issues? I'm just a lay over here, but I'm just wondering.
Yeah, it's partly, yeah. So the most of the airports, of course, need flat areas, and what we see is that there in many cases are land reclamations, so that is just very close to sea level, or even below, or just above, and that is always the case. And you need a landing strip that is a sort of, let's say, a flat area. And yes, also sometimes we discuss why not elevate a landing strip, but that is not, it is not limited to that only the landing strip. So you have to elevate much more, because the whole airport is connected to its surrounding area, like the connection, like a train or a metro system, the terminal. So what if? What's interesting is that some airports, so what I deliberately showed you the Rockhampton situation, because that is a sort of coping with floodings without dikes. I remember during the Changi benchmarks exercise, we also looked at Taipei Airport. And Taipei Airport is on the outside the city, but you have to imagine that's the north of Taiwan. But they have about 5 sorts of floodings, I think, including tsunamis. but also floodings, and the whole terminal actually is on a sort of stilt, and it is because it is on a sloped area towards the coast, and when having too much, because it can rain even harder, so it can rain, let's say, meters per day. That's very extreme. And that can cause land floodings, so over surface floodings, and to avoid that the terminal will be the obstruction to block that flooding, you have actually sort of floodgates under the building. So that's maybe an example. Although I think yes, that runway, because it is too vast or too, let's say, into big in dimensions, I think it's to although we pre-discussed with Floris about floating airports that don't have the issue of that elevation. They can actually move to, let's say, on a higher level when there's when the water level is higher, or they can move when floating towards the right direction in the wind. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that partly answer my question. I've been to Taipei Airport, by the way. I saw that it was elevated. Pretty cool place to go there anyway. So I noticed that there is discussion about it, and how about the focusing on, and not per se for elevation, but you already mentioned these critical points that are more to protect. Like, is there a big diversion possible between protecting, well, specific assets within an airport, or do you say, well, mostly we just choose for the whole area because, like you said, it's fast and it's always interconnected?
No, I think it is a combination.
Yeah.
So also Schiphol already decided to focus also on the local, and that depends a little bit because there are different kinds of floodings, and you
Of
have
course.
water from
Yeah.
different sides. So when
Yeah.
dealing with precipitation, and for example, it's about let's say low-lying entrances, or let's say the flight control. That's the big tower. Mostly has its own power supply.
Like that. Yeah.
For instance, so there's much more to do, and it's also not only flooding. So sometimes it's also because of let's say volcanic eruption, or it's about then you have in the drainage you have to have blockings.
Hmm.
Otherwise, you can have a fire
Oh,
throughout
yeah.
the whole drainage. Um, so there's so much more details, like also like dealing with birds. So that could be bird strikes. The example of Jamaica Bay. Jamaica Bay is in a ecological area. Vancouver as well. So most airports are on that, because that coastal areas, or let's say the lake areas or river areas, are mostly also for habitats, for animals and birds. Yeah.
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 Location.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is location. Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's a question I would have, location, but suppose we would be able to choose our location. Now we have thoughts about
Mm-hmm.
Schiphol in sea, or and actually there's a project I'm thinking of, Dili, Timor-Leste, very poor country. It just
Mm-hmm.
has one. Maybe I can show you. Is that a good case? And then
Yeah,
have
that's a
you
good
have
case.
your
Yeah.
because I'm flying there
Yeah,
at
the
the end
thing
of
is
next
that
month.
yeah.
So,
So when looking at smaller like island states, they're really
yeah.
depending on that airport. Yeah.
Yeah, so you have Japan with the floating airports
Mm-hmm.
we just discussed. So this is amazing. And then let me backtrack. Oh, airports. Oh, wait. Yeah, so now you see a lot of airports actually that have something. Hong Kong also floating, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then here in Timor-Leste, basically every disaster that you could think of is there. So there's
Mm-hmm.
volcanoes, there's landslides, there's it's not a lot of fun, and it
Tsunamis.
just
Yeah.
like a lot of in the region.
Yeah.
So it's quite and you can see it's very urban dense, the whole area. These are all mountains, so they cannot go anywhere. They need land basically, and the airport is taking up some space here.
Yep.
But it would be great to to make something out of it, and they need to expand. But basically, they already can't, as you can see in a lot of airports. There's everything around it. So now you probably have the chance, because they had severe floodings last year. So what would you do? I mean, if you could do it all over and they have to rebuild, they have to expand, and they might want to use this, would you put it in C, or what would you think?
Yeah, that depends a little bit, especially when there's a momentum. Of course, for example, what they did in Hong Kong, the old one, that was really in the city.
Yeah.
It not started in the city, but then the first airports are, let's say, founded 100 years ago. And then they became surrounded by the city.
Yeah.
So they had to replace that, and that is a sort of momentum. And in this case, I think it could be interesting, especially on this kind of coasts, to look at is there a sort of urban development momentum? For Manila, we are looking for that.
Yeah.
I know that there is,
Yeah.
and also for Ho Chi Minh City, there are also ideas, because on the east side of the river of Mekong, they are looking for the urban expansion of the city, and that is also higher, elevated. So that could be a possible new airport development as well.
Yeah.
Although that is just on elevation and the momentum of urban development. Same time, because this is coastal, it could also be interesting to look at for maybe there is a sort of nature-based coastal defense that can be combined. I know for New Orleans, the runway, there's also a single runway in the Louis Armstrong, and that is partly in the marshes. It is also part the flood defense of the city. So it is partly, so it is like, say, almost like the dike itself. So it is a sort of multifunctional dike. You land on the dike, almost. So partly.
And those are
And
great win-win situations, of course, because then you get these natural habitats that needs to be protected, and then you get a really strong economic driver in order to protect those areas.
Yeah. Yeah, and at the same time, it's always a sort of hard discussion, because we also discussing the environmental impact of airports, and therefore we would like to have less, let's say, that we use it less, maybe. Otherwise, so this kind of remote locations, and also especially the island states, are really depending on it for transport, for their lifeline. So that is also still very vital in that case. Yeah.
All right. Other questions?
No. Almost time as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually 15 minutes over, but we know that when you invite Nanco.
Okay.
No, it was a compliment. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot to talk about it. Yeah. Shall we then close off? So maybe looking at next week. Yeah, that's a totally different topic. It's about infiltration, subsurface infiltration, like crates, infiltratiekratten, and there's a lot of questions about in the low-lying areas, New Orleans, where Nanco talked about, all over the world, but of course in the Netherlands as well. You have groundwater and then infiltration crates, but you need enough ground to ensure that the infiltration crates don't break. If a truck would run over, it would be break. So is that 70 centimeters? Is that enough? Would you go higher so we have more storage and less groundwater in it in the low-lying parts? That's the question. And BaFin, in this case, Nick Brink and a colleague will talk about how to ensure that we have safety, but also enough storage in subsurface and how they function on the long term. Sounds like a nice topic, I would say. It's a bit
Great.
different than airport. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. I have one question for Nanco, but it can be outside of the talk, so everyone that goes can go.
All right. I will close the session and the recording.
And I will see you next week.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.